Thanks everyone for being here, especially those who got here just before the rain. This is a kind of crowd that I think wants to know about how to think through how we speak up, think through how we process the many conversations we have with our friends, our families, and the many groups that we leave because we don't know how to say what we really feel. And I think the conversation that we are going to have later today may address some of those, but in the form of not speech, but also writing and how we think through our present time. Before the discussion, which I will moderate later, Devika Rege will talk about her book, and that's kind of why we've come together today. It's called The Quarterlife, and I've just had the pleasure of reading it in the last few weeks. I would say it was a pleasure, but also an unnerving experience, because many of the insights that she has in this book, which is about a bunch of friends and family based in Mumbai and Maharashtra, kind of expressing, going through a period of anxiety and change, and talking their way through all of it. There is a lot of talking in this book, which a lot of the characters also talk about. This book is called The Quarterlife because most of these people are young, and they're set broadly in Maharashtra in 2014, just after a party called the Bharat Party has won an intensely divisive election. A Wall Street consultant, Naren, abandons his American dream to return to India, which inspires him full of promise, and he's lost his hope in the American dream, and he's come back to India to find the Indian dream. His brother Rohit, who's an aspiring filmmaker and a sort of restless young man, is on a journey to find who he is, who his people are, and ends up befriending members of a Hindu nationalist student group. Amanda, an American, is also in India to find her purpose. She works in an NGO in a Muslim majority slum. This book, it sort of dives into their ambitions, beliefs, politics, and personal relationships of these three people, but also several of their friends. For me, it was quite unnerving, as I said earlier, because it brought up a lot of the thoughts I myself have, a lot of the things I haven't said in a group, or things I have said and regretted or wish I had said better when I'm lying down sleepless at night. Because this is a book that is about the present moment, and now Devika will talk more about how it was to write it, how it was to think through it in the present day.
Hello, good evening everyone. Just go right, you can hear me. And thank you for coming out tonight despite the rain. And thank you to the BIC for hosting this event, and to Aakar and Rohini for joining us. As Sandhya mentioned, I've just published Quarterlife, and it's a novel about young people finding their politics. And as Rohini mentioned, it's a story set in 2014, defining year for 21st century Indian politics, and it is set in Maharashtra. Now, Maharashtra is a really fascinating case study because it is a vast state, it is a wealthy state, it is a state that is far away from the Hindi-speaking heartland, and has a strong regional identity. So why is Maharashtra and not UP the ideological home of Hindu nationalism? So it was exactly to understand this kind of complexity that my research for this novel went on for almost 6 years. Through that time, I read a lot, but I also interviewed people in corporate offices and slums in Mumbai, visited historical sites and universities in Pune, shadowed activists in mining villages in the Konkan, and political shakhas in small town Satara. And often my friends would ask me why I wasn't writing a book of nonfiction. To be honest, fiction was an instinctive choice, but such questions helped me reflect on what the novel form achieves that nonfiction does not when it comes to historical and political events. Now, since these are real-world events, let's begin with fiction's relationship to facts. In journalism, you find facts and you verify them as backed by scientific or statistical or historical evidence, and even going so far as a personal opinion. Sorry. Hello. And even going so far as a personal opinion might be seen as compromising the reporter's neutrality. In nonfiction books and columns, you may go further, provide an analysis, provide an interpretation. In creative nonfiction, you might even weave the facts or testimonies into a very gripping novelistic story. But you are still grounded in the Latin concept of truth as veritas. Fiction, by contrast, is seen as the realm of the imagination, though every reader knows this is not entirely true. What distinguishes fiction is not that it is divorced from reality, but that it does not carry nonfiction's burden of proof. And this frees up the novelist to engage with reality in some very unique ways. Now, there are many, many ways, but in the interest of time, since I've been given about 15 minutes, I will be focusing this evening on only 3 of them. The first thing that fiction does is that fiction writers work with an essential element of fiction called composites. Now, this means the blurring or melding of 2 or 5 or several real-world people into a fictional character. For instance, to craft Rohit, who is a young filmmaker who is insecure about his cultural roots, I might take the nose of one such young man I met, the dress code of the second, and the punchlines of the third. And while this is often a subconscious creative process, it isn't only an act of play. The writer knows instinctively if a trait that is awarded to a character is working or not, and upon publication, so does the reader. The barometer that both of them are using is whether a certain detail rings true. To arrive at a powerful composite, the writer must study multiple cases of people or events in the real world and cut away those parts of the isolated case that is not in some way telling or symbolic of the rest. The composite is that friend in a work of fiction who is like none of your friends in real life and yet tells you something about all of your friends because she defines the essence of friendship. Now, composites apply not only to characters, but also to settings and plots. And when you bring all of these together, you arrive at a true-to-life simulation of the world that the writer can then manipulate, since this is fiction, to explore new imaginative possibilities. For instance, the midsection of Quarterlife sees a 30-page long debate between 9 such composites that occupy very different political positions. Among them is corporate Naren, who loves the development dream and believes he is the last liberal alive. There's journalist Kedar, a lover of Marx, who thinks Naren and Rohit are the worst kind of conservatives. There's Omkar, a small-town OBC youth who is obsessed with the idea of a Hindu brotherhood and sees himself not as a conservative, but as a radical. There's Amanda, who has worked in a slum and sees the pointlessness of armchair debates. And Cyrus, whose politics have been accused of going only as far as pride. There's also Mansi, a Dalit who studied at IIM and keeps her fury silent to protect her ambition. There's Ifran Gyan, an interfaith couple whose relationship comes apart by the end of the night. Now, while I cannot judge my own book as a writer, as a reader of other novels, I know that if the composites themselves are caricatures that have been poorly constructed from perhaps just sitting in London reading headlines and reflecting social media biases in India, or as Naipaul says, too nakedly autobiographical, the novel will lose its density and power, and that feeling that every line in it uncovers something fundamental about our shared reality. In one of my very first interviews, I was asked if my novel is political. I said to the interviewer, "Do you mean polemical?" In which case the answer is no. I am less interested in advocating for a political position than in understanding how society and human nature works. Then I asked, "Or do you mean, is the novel not a mirror that reflects society as it is, but a prism that refracts it?" In this case, the answer is yes. Quarterlife is a book that is deeply preoccupied with ethics. The writer Orhan Pamuk says in this beautiful book called The Naive and Sentimental Novelist, the art of the novel becomes political not when the author expresses political views, but when we make an effort to understand someone who is different from us. This means feeling compassion before passing judgment. Now, for me personally, novels are not an education through compassion, either for the reader or the writer, but through identification, which brings me to the second point in my talk. Readers identify strongly with fictional characters, and novels achieve this through the subtle art of exploring what is called a character's interiority. This refers to the character's innermost thoughts. And I don't mean their secrets or confessions, but a much more intimate and comprehensive subjectivity, which shows the ways in which a character experiences the entire world, whether it is the smell of rain in his hometown, which we can perhaps all relate to, or the milky scent of his mother's sari, or the metallic odor of blood as he kills another man. These days, it is common for creative nonfiction to use novelistic techniques, but the moment you step inside another's head, you are in the territory of fiction. That is what the word creative implies. In either case, interiority seduces and unnerves us because it may involve recognizing that the things we most hate about others are what we secretly loathe about ourselves. Fiction educates both the writers and readers by generating feelings of shame, guilt, pleasure, sympathy, and desire upon inhabiting a wide range of characters. To achieve this, the writer often cannot be very emotional herself and has to set aside feelings to lean into what someone else is saying and thinking. There were many times in my research when I felt the muscles of my face harden because I was angry at the narrowness of another's political imagination, or then feeling defensive because what they were saying revealed about the narrowness of my own. Writing fiction for me has been a constant process of disciplining myself, not only to listen, but imagine the possible places where my interiority might overlap with someone I never thought it could. Quarterlife, therefore, has been a way for me to reckon with the complexity, the plurality, the ambiguity, and the ethical messiness of our everyday lives as citizens. This brings me to my third and final point. Because the novel form is so long, some fiction writers, even within a first novel, eventually get preoccupied with the way in which stories are told. For instance, what does it say about a novel that critiques social inequality if the story itself is only about 3 protagonists, 1 white and 2 upper caste? This guilt caught up with me about a third of the way into Quarterlife. I started to ask myself how it would change the plot if I brought in a greater diversity of voices. After all around us, shifts in who gets a voice, however incremental, are bending the course of history. At times, people's voices call about a change in form. At other times, a change in form gives people a voice. The two go back and forth, bringing each other into being. What finer example is there of this than the experiment of democracy in India? That is why the number of perspectives in this novel goes from 3 characters to 9, to that of an entire city on a night when it descends into violence. The way the story is told reveals the novel's own expanding democratic consciousness. Of course, the novel does not entirely succeed, because no book or no person can inhabit an entire city, let alone an entire country. Quarterlife's protagonists remain from the lower to the upper middle class, and even when the novel goes beyond, its overarching structure still betrays a very privileged perception of what constitutes a good democracy. There are also other unresolved questions. For instance, could giving so many characters a mic present a feel-good liberal utopia that is very far from the reality of our actual public discourse? Or does depicting violence on a woman or between communities in gory detail confront the truth or amplify a culture of violence? The answer is I don't know. As a writer, this is where I ran up against the limits of my own imagination. To fill hundreds of pages with thousands of tiny sensory details is such an incredible expanse of a canvas, greater than any other art form, that fiction writers find it very hard to hide. And yet, if there is one thing I love most about fiction, not only as a writer but also as a reader, It is precisely this, the fact that novels explore and capture the truth about the values of an epoch by betraying the blind spots and darkness in their own creators. Our theme tonight is the truth in fiction. Now, I am not a philosopher, but every layman today knows that truth is a historically contested idea. Yet, in a post-truth world where the nature of what is real is itself under question, I have found it grounding to revisit three ancient concepts related to the truth, not for what they say what the truth might be, but for the paths they posit to finding it. The first is the Latin veritas, or verifiable truths. Novels aspire to veritas indirectly, in that the more the writer is vested in seeing and researching the real world for what it is, the more powerful her composites will be. The second one is the Greek aletheia. In ancient theater, the term was used to describe a process of slowly drawing a curtain to reveal what is written. Aletheia refers not to what is in the world, but the way things appear in the world. For instance, if a society is a sick patient, veritas is the facts in the terminal cancer report, and aletheia is the way in which the doctor or the priest helps the patient to make existential sense of their illness, both of which have important implications for the course of treatment that she chooses. Fiction is both an exercise in making meaning and in questioning the forms through which we do. And the results of its narrative experiments are seen in several other mediums, from the way history is written, to creative nonfiction, to film, to television serials. The final expression of truth is the Sanskrit, or process, is the Sanskrit neti neti. Translated as not this, not that, it is the process of realizing the self, or God if you are a believer, or reality by defining not what is, but what is not. Good literary fiction does not give us direct answers in the form of statements, but constantly nuances our questions and undermines the surety of our positions so that we may push our political imaginations further. Finally, to conclude, even when we are talking about historical and political events, no writer wants to view their art in narrow utilitarian terms. To assume that art is for anything but art's sake is often perceived as either a clamp on creative freedom or undermining of creative integrity. But personally for me, as of a decade of writing fiction, the commitment to truth as a process has never felt in any way impinging on my artistic freedom to fabricate a world. If anything, I believe that the two are as inseparable as the ideal of personal freedom is with having a conscience. Thank you.
A lot of what you said triggered many more questions, and I think it might have in your minds as well. But to give you maybe a minute's break after what you said, let me start with Aakar. Yeah, that's the only reason. Aakar, you have, I always feel like in the last few years, seeing the number of books that you're writing and continuing to write, I feel like you're writing as if you're running out of time. And most of what you've written till now is non-fiction. You have just published fiction. We'll talk about that later, about what that impulse was. But all of this non-fiction that you've written explores different questions. Some of it is translation, some of it looks into the political moment. What is actually motivating you to write these books? You also write columns, you've been a journalist, you've also been an activist. What is the motivating impulse?
So I think we're going through a period in our history where there isn't sufficient material to be able to understand what's going on around you. If you were to understand why it is that, to give you an example of one law. In 2021, Madhya Pradesh passed a law which said that if a person from one religion married another religion, they would have to take permission from a magistrate or a collector if they were in city. This is an old law. But the state retained the power, this is new, to undo the marriage if it felt that the conversion of one person was forced in some way, including if the marriage had children. So the government, the union, the state in India has arrogated to itself this kind of authority to be able to implement an ideology that's coming to us through the media, through debates in drawing rooms, through law, that we don't fully understand and haven't been able to access. And I think that I write primarily to understand what it is that we are doing to ourselves and why. And I think that one of the problems here is that the sphere is so vast that it requires the writing of books rather than columns. To give you another example, at some point in the near future, we have more billionaires than Germany, but at some point in the near future, we'll become a bigger economy than Germany. India will become a bigger economy than Germany. Bangladesh's per capita GDP went past India in 2018. So the average Bangladeshi today is richer than the average Indian. We don't care about that. The fact that India has become bigger than Germany is what we care about. Why? I'm saying that to understand such things, I think it's important to look at long-form text that engages with the reality of the world, which is why I write primarily.
So this making sense, you also talked about it when when you did your interviews, when you met all of these different people. Did you know early on that you are going to set your book, your impulse is to write fiction, so I won't ask why fiction, but this moment to write about the present moment, the ongoing moment. In Aakar's preface, he says, in the Price of the Modi Years, he describes it as a history of these present times. For me, it felt like your book was sort of that, actually. And it is a story of these present times. I wouldn't say history. I think Jeet, in one of the book covers, or somewhere, he says it's a history of a nation, a secret history of a nation. So all of these things are how we are seeing your book. Is this how you were seeing it when you were thinking about it and writing it? That it would capture the moment, some moment in history, the ongoing moment?
So in 2013, when I sort of had done this 2-year degree in the States and I came back, and I knew I wanted to come back. I knew that India was my subject and I wanted to find. I'd started writing short stories about the country and I sort of knew that this is where I wanted to locate myself and work. And 2013 was it's an interesting time. I mean, to take everyone back, there was just, the streets were full of protest. You had, vigils on women's safety. You had the whole anti-corruption movement. So there was a sudden feeling of India was young and there's all these young people kind of finding their voice. And especially for someone like me, I don't have an arts background. I don't have a journalism background. I didn't grow up, with writers in the vicinity. I was this corporate person who suddenly was in the streets, raising banners. And there was something about that gave me this feeling that this is some kind of, big shift in our way of thinking. And then the election rolled in, and I think a lot of people were surprised by the result. I mean, there were those who celebrated the result because they felt that this is a radical new shift in our way of, thinking, the development dream and so on. There were those who were shocked that on the back of all this, seemingly this progressive moment, the party had come to power. But what was interesting to me was just the way in which it transformed our relationship to politics. I don't think our political identities had ever been as all-encompassing in the past as they did after that moment. And so I think it was really to not so much write a history of the moment, but to understand the psychology of the moment that this book took off and took form. So that's where it began. And I did have a feeling around 2014 that this is something, that this is a kind of changing of the guards. Like, I didn't think it was something momentary. And so I knew I was onto a subject that I would be sitting with for a long time, even before the election results were out. So, yeah.
One of the, when Sandhya was introducing this thing about what moment do we look back or look around, how long it takes to look at something. Yeah. In that question, somehow it's implied that you've written after, or I don't know what it implies, whether you've written 10 years after, whether you've written during, so when something is changing constantly around you and you're writing, and I'm asking this as a journalist who's constantly responding, right? I'm reacting to things. Yes. At the same time, for me, that is dissatisfying. So then I go back to sit and try to write a book, which will take some more time and not react immediately.
Right.
What was it like for you to sort of, and Aakar talked about that, this thing of constant change, you want to make sense of it, so you write. So writers do that to make sense, we write. What was in your mind when this thing is constantly changing? Did the direction of your characters change? And it seemed a little bit like that towards the end for me, reading. Yeah, so what was it like to respond? Did you feel like you needed to respond, or just let the characters change the way they were?
I mean, those two things go back and forth, like I said. Like sometimes you'll feel the need to respond and it generates a new character, and then that character calls for a new kind of response. And so it sort of is a process that keeps, the goalpost keeps shifting when you work on anything that long, which I'm sure, even nonfiction writers would have a similar experience of researching a book for a long time. I think one thing I was careful of was, since the book remains in 2014, I tried not to, the characters can't get ahead of themselves in retrospect. And so you don't want to write a piece that's completely teleological in that sense. And so while the years later did clarify for me kind of what was going on in 2014, it didn't, and so it sort of took a kind of fuller and fuller form. I don't think it kind of, it sort of layered what I was thinking about, but I don't think it completely changed the story that I had intended for 2014, in the sense there was smoke and mirrors. There was the sense that the moment could go in many directions for a lot of people, and I wanted to maintain some of that, because if I lost that, it wouldn't be true to that kind of moment if it came again in history. So that felt important, yeah.
How does that reflect with what you wrote? The fact that you were speaking about a group of people in your book who had lived through a certain experience and were able to articulate it through your work. The length of time is longer in your case, but in what sense was it different from what she wrote?
I think I felt like he's talking about my book, which is on Sri Lanka, post-war Sri Lanka, where I looked at 3 people in surviving the war. I actually intended to write quite similar to what Devika said, only about the post-war moment, during which I was reporting. So I acted like a journalist, like a pakka journalist, right? So I was writing. Maybe I'll see much more between the lines, try to write about things that people who were experiencing it at that time, post-Civil War, could not talk about, could not articulate. But then I realized that I could not talk about the present without talking about the past. So then I went further. The time span of what the book covers expanded. Because everyone was thinking back of the things lost, and thinking forward of the things that they couldn't achieve, of the hope of a country, of the losses. So it did not seem possible to... So in a moment of ferment, in a moment of change, people were looking back and looking forward. So I could not look at that. So I mean, that's why I was so interested in knowing this thing. And, and what you say about the psychology of characters, and these are ordinary people, and they're having these very charged conversations, these debates. And I often think, a person asked me during one of the talks for my book, why I am writing about ordinary people. Because they expected that a non-fiction writer would write about powerful people, because power is what confuses and confounds for most people. And it's almost like we don't need to know what ordinary people think, maybe what they go through, but Aakar, you have thought a lot about people in power, right? So, and especially some people in power, and you've tried, and I think more than most, especially of Narendra Modi, you have written very directly and analyzed who this person is, the psychology, of course through performance, but also through your sense of who he is, how he acts. And I think I feel like history making is also about writing about those people in power, and I find less of that in fiction, much more of that in non-fiction. Of course, there's hagiographies, lots of them. But so what is it like? What is the process of thinking and writing about a person in power?
It's difficult to access those people, whether it's people like Stalin or people who don't write themselves and limit what is written about them. So one has to speculate about what goes on. And the assumption always has to be that human beings are in some form at base level alike, and you can tap into that likeness when you write about them. I've met Modi more than once, but it's difficult to understand how it is that somebody like him would rejoice in what it is that they have presided over, or how it is that they take joy in basic things like exclusion. So for instance, one of the great things that makes us Indian is that we think that we are accommodative at the level of society and at the level of culture. That we say that, of course, there is a certain level of hypocrisy in this. And I came here, I was driven by a driver in my car, and so there is that distance. But there is always a sense that, okay, as a nation, we will take people who live here in this geographical space along, that we are all part of one thing. But for the first time in our history, you've got, since 1947, for the first time, no chief minister in India who's Muslim, no union minister who's Muslim, no BJP MLA, they've got more than 1,000 MLAs across India, who is a Muslim. The Congress was accused, rightly I think, by Jinnah of being a Hindu party. The Congress had 3% Muslims in its 1,000-person membership. The BJP has 0. So we are looking at ourselves as a nation, and there is validation, there's popular validation of this through the vote. And so we're looking at ourselves as a people who are back to 1946, where the nation is divided essentially into popular divisional politics and validation of it. And there is somebody who is lauded for doing this, that this is a good thing. When Jinnah was saying what he did about the Congress, there might have been some pushback saying that, okay, the Congress ought not to do this. You have some representational figures, Azad or whoever. We don't even have those now. The person who oversees in the UP cabinet, in the Uttar Pradesh cabinet, the person who oversees Waqf in the cabinet is a Hindu. What kind of thinking pushes this when all of us, for the most part at least, come from this sense that we should be inclusive in what we do? We might be hypocritical, which we are, but we think that we should be. Here there is not even thought. There is no concession even to having an Azad in your cabinet. What does that say about us as a people, that we validate it and that we make such a person the epitome of what our nation and our state should be? I think that is what interests me, and then I need to read into what that would mean. But I think that these are fascinating questions for us as Indians to ask of ourselves. This person is this person, whoever he or she is, should not really affect us. What should affect us is our validation of it. There is a heroism that is associated with this that we need to examine.
Devika, in your this character who, the political moment is there, but this is into 2014, so there is promise in the air, and it is, we haven't reached a point of asking it. All of this hasn't come to pass, what Aakar talked about, but every page is charged with that. Either nightmare or promise, or whatever person is, they can call it. And a lot of it is embodied in some of those, the brotherhood characters that come in quite in the middle of the book. But what most struck me was this character, Rohit's response to it, and how he is drawn by it, seduced by the idea, almost comforted by some of the identity politics, in his own search, in his feeling of hollowness. And he fills it with what the promise of identity and everything that the reason you get up in the morning is because of who you are, not because what you have to do and all of that. And I remember this line that I wrote it down. Amanda says that unlike him, she cares less about who she is and more about what she's for. And Rohit is just searching for who he is. And in that moment, he meets these characters. And you said in your talk that when you interviewed these people, Sometimes it told you something about yourself, also your responses to it. Writing about this group, so at any point did you, the political and literary impulses and what you were trying to do, how, when they interacted, how was it difficult or was it actually quite creative in what it threw up?
Yes, I think this impulse to, and we can call it political and literary, but let's just say the impulse to observe as compared to the impulse to judge, right? And there's a book that I read shortly before I'd started writing Quarterlife, and it's Kierkegaard's Either Or. And one of the beautiful distinctions that he makes in that is between the spiritual and the ethical. And we would not see those two in conflict normally. They seem to be two things that should fly well into each other. But what he describes as spiritual is what we would consider a sort of modern-day state of mindfulness, when you are observing something, you are completely absorbed. You forget yourself, you forget your own opinions, and if you start judging in that moment, you're going to observe badly. But as soon as you get into this state, the ethicist jumps up within you and says, yes, but on whose time and at whose cost are you doing this? Your book is coming out, happily 9 years after an event, and I don't have what you have, which is that what one gets from responding on a day-to-day basis. And so there were certainly moments, like I said, when I had to discipline myself to settle down, and to listen. And I don't think the tension between those two selves was ever resolved through the writing of the book. I don't think it is still resolved. I don't think it is resolvable. But I do think that one of the values that novels and novel writing bring to the table is that it gives you the freedom to observe. I think that's why I say even someone like Arundhati Roy, there's a non-fiction book coming out very frequently, but the fiction comes out once in 20 years, because you really have that time to just sit and observe and observe and observe and observe. And I do think that if all our literature became protest literature or polemical in some way, we would be the poorer for it. And it's not to say I'm a neutral observer, it's just to say that this is what this discipline pushes you to do, and that has value. And so I did try to keep returning to that while working. And no, it wasn't it wasn't always easy. You do hate yourself sometimes, and like that's there, yeah.
What do you mean by that?
I mean, this thing of interiority, I mean, I think Aakar has some incredible descriptions of people in power. But that is essentially you're able to stand outside and say that you are someone who is unlearned and charismatic and, use the adjectives. But in interiority, as the writer and later as the reader, you kind of have to slip in, like, oh, we both like the smell of the rain of our hometown. Oh, we both had an ideal of patriotism when we were children. What has that led to now? And how have our paths ever so slightly split and then gone in like these wild directions? And so before you know it, you are empathizing with people you thought you would judge. There's that Kabir line, Bura jo dekhna mein gaya, bura na milya koi. Like, you find in fact that there is so much in common between you and, and all kinds of other people, however different they are from yourself. And that can be discomforting, but that is the power, I think, of fiction. It imbricates you, it implicates you in everything that is going on. You don't get to stand outside and point. You are complicit. So.
The compassion was obvious throughout, especially for people that we now claim to understand fully, especially people who are of a different ideology, but we actually may not ask, that we stopped asking questions of them. Or maybe there was a moment when everybody was asking questions and now we are like, we've got all the answers, there's nothing more to ask. But what struck me, and something that is quite rare and which is, I keep thinking of when I find myself in what feels like an echo chamber, is that we don't criticize each other as much anymore. We take sides and we've stopped doing that. And I felt like a lot of characters were so cruel about the other in your book in such direct ways that, you squirm, but you like it. I really liked it. Like, I'll just read one part where Rohit is talking about, he's just looking at his friends who are just chatting and they've just smoked up or they have had a drink and they're talking about politics, as we all do now, at night, at 2 o'clock in the night. And he's saying they're all outraged that a man with blood on his hands has the nation's mandate. Yet, they thrive on their exclusivity, and it is not the otherness of dusty poets in prison, but the snobbery of teens who know they are the in crowd. So I felt, oh wow, this is so so cruel. This guy sitting there and thinking about it, but so on point. When I find that now when and non-fiction writers write, sometimes I have to fight for myself a sense of defensiveness, that to not let that come, to see clear-eyed, and to almost, because we want dissent, and we want people who have the courage to dissent, to speak up, and we don't want to crowd them out. But at the same time, I ask myself often, is this the moment to also to be clear-eyed and critique the who we think of as liberals? Do you fight it at all? I feel, when I read you, I don't feel like that fight is there, but I'm sure you think it may be in your head. A sense of sometimes you feel like you throw a bone for the liberal sometimes, or kind of defend some of the ways in which one functions. I'm talking about when you wrote The Anatomy of Protest, and in that you say so many successes, but we also know how many failures and how many missteps and how much catastrophe a wrong step can cause. Yeah. So do you feel sometimes defensive? I have never read you like that, but do you think about it?
I think the benefit of having a kind of simple mind is that you view the world in Manichaean terms.
Come on.
When you come from a
please go beyond the simple. It sounds like someone else now.
When you come from a community from Pune that has ruled parts of North India for large parts of the 18th and 19th century, you're a different mindset than somebody who comes from Surat has very little contribution to the world. I think that the interesting feature of our time is how easy it is to divide what you would consider to be right from wrong. And I'm not saying this from the moral point of view. I'm saying this from the point of view of an outsider, if there were one, looking at what was going on in India not just post 2014, I should accept that, before that as well, but to see what the state is doing to its population and to be able to consider as a writer whether or not what it ought to be doing is what it should be doing and what it is doing. And I think it's easy for me to be able to at least separate the two. It's much more difficult in fiction. I think that for me at least, the writing of fiction is an order of magnitude more difficult than writing of non-fiction. If I had to have a non-fiction thesis in my head, let's say that post-2014 India suffered. Let's say that's the thesis. How would you demonstrate it? You would look at the economy, you would look at civil society, you would look at laws, you would look at the constitutional artifacts that we have and see whether there is damage. If you can show that there is damage, the book holds. Non-fiction, because it is an act of a creation, you have to pull it out of your head. You have to assume it's about engagement between people. It's about how other people think. It's about how other people respond to the world. Is much more difficult, for me at least. And I don't think it's just for me. Objectively speaking, if you were to look at the arts, you would have prodigies. She spoke of Naipaul. You would have, these are his words, more or less. You have prodigies in music and mathematics. You would have a prodigy in painting as well, Basquiat. There are no prodigies in writing. There is no great young novelist. There cannot be. You need to be able to experience the world enough and be able to absorb it, to be able to interpret it in a way that is useful. Then you need to have the talent which she has, which I don't have unfortunately, to be able to put it down in words. The composition of a paragraph of quality is a thing of beauty. Many of us can't do it. And I think that it's a great thing when these two things come together, the ability to be able to interpret this world from the eyes of other people and be able to put it down in the sort of prose that she has in her words.
I should say that I don't think it has anything to do with simplicity or complexity of a mind, least of all of communities, by which I assume you mean castes. But I think this is I think they just perform two very different and very important roles in society. And both of them come under the banner of literature, right? Non-fiction books are also great literature, and so are fiction books. And it's just that they're bringing they're disciplining you into a different way of responding to the moment. And if one does not do its job well, the other will collapse. If the press is not vigilant, goodbye all your novels that try to stand up against demagogues. And if there are no novels, then all these kind of creative possibilities with the facts kind of will not hold for long, like what you do with the facts beyond a point. And so I think they fulfill different functions in society. And you can have bad and simple novelists, and you can have bad and simple oversimplifying nonfiction writers, and you can have incredibly astute writers on either side as well. And so it's not, it's more a function of the angle at which you're coming from. And I do think, Aakar's work is some of the most complex I've read on the moment. And I'm very glad it exists.
He says, Naipaul, that the novel is dead. He said this about 30 years ago. Because of the fact that its origins came out of the fact that the Russians were trying to interpret their world to themselves and to their readers in a time when there was no other way of doing it. That, Dostoevsky or Turgenev or whoever was doing what they were doing, whether in terms of reflecting societal mores or crime or sexual relationships, because there was no other means to be able to do this. And he says, Naipaul does, that because of the advent of media, particularly television and so on, that has lost its value. That you no longer need that. To be able to do that, you can communicate it much more directly, whether through film or through a documentary, than you could through a novel. Unfortunately, I don't think that it's a fully honed argument, because it should hold true also of the non-fiction book. The non-fiction book also should die. If you don't have the ability to communicate better, which we don't as a writer, I don't think I have the ability to communicate better of the material that I write. I noticed somebody in the crowd, Arshia Sattar. The fact that a documentary or a film can do a better job than what I as a writer can do, it should hold true of both the worlds. It's not true, I think. You still can penetrate much deeper into the reality of what's going on in our time and our world, both through fiction and to a limited extent through non-fiction as well, in the same way that you could in the 19th century.
I mean, there's a few things I wanted to respond to that. One was just, Naipaul, I'm not sure, I think it's Patrick French who said, he famously always said the novel was dead when he was having a writer's block. And then he would find reasons for it. But I think this thing about what books do, that television, film, they're essentially visual mediums. And so no matter how hard they try, they cannot inhabit interiority. And interiority is language for human beings in such a big way. Yes, there are visuals, but it is also language. And even sort of filmmakers like Tarkovsky, who are very invested in this kind of consciousness project and these kind of vast visual landscapes, the furthest you can go is dialogue, which is what people say. You can go as far as action, which is what people do. But you can't get beyond a point into their head. And so, in fact, when a novel comes out that does not explore enough interiority, I just wait for the film. And so, I think whenever when photography came in, paintings had to evolve, and modern art was in a sense born, because you couldn't just realism, verisimilitude was not enough because the photograph was doing it damn well. And so I think new technology always pushes forms to evolve, and I think the novel has responded brilliantly in the way that interiority has increased in the novel over the last, since film has come. And you can see that the new novelistic techniques are directly impacting films. Like you have films and TV series that unfurl almost like novels in terms of chapters and kind of points of view and things like that. So I think, I personally haven't felt that feeling of redundancy. Maybe it's only the template that has changed. And the other thing I wanted to say was about Dostoevsky, you mentioned. And that is, I think there's actually a lovely other essay on Dostoevsky and the novel by Bakhtin, in which he talks about how the novel is one of those forms that's seen as concomitant, its growth with democracy. And this thing that you said about the common man becoming the subject is very much a function of the novel growing alongside democracy and saying, look, Tolstoy says, history may talk about all these big kings and queens and all of that, but here is fiction, the kind of perspective, the people's history, which nonfiction also does now, again, an export from novels. But in that, it is very much the print media and the existence of the newspaper that gives Dostoevsky his form, where he realizes that you can have multiple points of view talking at once, where he realizes that you can have history and the future distilled into a single moment, like that idea of chronology breaks down. And I think that's one of the other sort of fascinating things that the novel does. And the more, the more democracy spreads, the more that's going to get, I think, exciting in terms of the ways it moves and morphs. And I don't think that the novel is kind of dead at all, just finding new kinds of goalposts and relevance with every generation.
At this point, Aakar, you want to talk about what in reality was so dissatisfying that you had to, I felt like maybe there was something dissatisfying that you had to find some closure in the novel that is coming out, or maybe I'm reading it wrong.
It's much more banal than that. So on Twitter, somebody said that it would be interesting to read a story about the PMO. And this was happening in a period when India accidentally set off a missile that went and landed in Pakistan. In most civilized countries, this would be a matter of shock and like, well, how the hell can I? Here it was just, oh, acha, wahan pe gira. So I thought it would be a good story to write about such things, somebody in power, having absolute power, being held in awe by large parts of the population, most of the population, I should say, who determines one day that the currency in your pocket is no longer valid. Like, screw it. Like, no. Like, I'll take. I thought it was interesting that the BBC filed 241 RTIs, which asked who in government, this was 1 year after it happened, who in government, they did this in 2021, who in the government of India, the Union government of India, knew that a national lockdown was being called on the day it was? And the answer was nobody. Nobody knew. The disaster management did not know, healthcare did not know. It was like one man saying, COVID, whatever, like, band karo. And it happened. I'm saying that's fantastic. I'm saying that it's gorgeous. For somebody who's a writer, it's very good material. So I thought, acha, I'll write a novel on this. My problem was that I had no idea how to write a novel. And I had no idea what a novel was. So I began writing it, and I wrote 12,000 words, which is a fifth of what the publishers normally want, which is 60,000 words. I should say to those of you who are planning on writing a novel or are writing one yourselves. My problem was that there was no character movement. My character was the same person that he remained exactly in the same space that he was for, like, that doesn't work. That works as in the TV serial. So Friends, I can't remember the name of the character, but Joey remains Joey from the first episode of the serial till the end. And the blonde woman, can somebody? Phoebe remains Phoebe through, there is no change. And you go back to it for that. You want the comfort of knowing that, oh, I'll have these people. And I thought of it as being a yes minister, that okay, we'll have this guy who will, like, send down these fatwas saying we will ban, currency, we will stop the country, we will have a lockdown. But then there was no movement. So then I wrote 12,000 and I threw it away. And then what I did was that I changed the way that the story would unfurl. And there's a sort of dramatic change in the first 500 words. I hope you'll buy the novel. It's outside for you to buy. And then I looked at how it is that somebody from my side of the argument, which is what we call civil society. I don't know how civil it is, but some people who work for change in the state from the outside, that you want laws to be changed, you want the government to behave better. How would somebody like that, if they came to power, what would they do? And I think that so that's what the basis of the novel is. I should say once again that writing fiction is very difficult, particularly if one is a writer who is willing to examine one's own work. And I think that That's the hardest part. It's easier for a columnist. I make my money out of writing columns, and that's easy because you can just throw it away and you don't know that, you don't care actually, you know. And I shouldn't say this because I make a living out of it, but I'm saying that writing those 800 words is the easiest part of my life. The waking up early enough to do the yoga class 3 times a week is the hard part. Writing a column is easy. Writing a book is damn difficult. Writing a work of fiction is doubly damn difficult. Because you have to, you're facing, your words face yourself in terms of cadence, in terms of meaning, in terms of depth, in terms of realism, in terms of honesty, in a way that very few things do. And which is why I think that though most writers, including myself, do not make a living out of writing, it is one of the most gorgeous and most satisfying things to do.
Devika, was there anything from reality that you found unable to handle in the fiction?
Yeah, I think one thing that I really struggle with is scenes of violence, and me and Rohini have spoken about this actually. I think it's an assumption, and it's a question to you as well, but I think when you're writing nonfiction, somewhere you're saying this is what reality was, and so you can really go into those dark places because you are not imbricated in creating it in some way yourself. But I think in fiction, because it is your imagination at play, what does it say when you look or tap very clearly into the thoughts of a racist or a misogynist, or display in gory detail, the way in which someone is abused? Does it just add to violence in society? And I think Amitav Ghosh has this lovely long-form essay on him as a young man experiencing the 1984 riots, and how when he chose to finally write about it through fiction, he did not have a single scene in which there was any kind of brutality, because he felt it was morally problematic. It was the creation, the generation of something that did not exist, that is coming into play because he is imagining it, this moment of violence. I mean, there were many moments of violence, but this particular one you created as the fiction writer. But of course, there's Manto, and Aakar has translated Manto wonderfully, who's always talking about the darkness in his heart and goes right out there, and that takes a different kind of courage. And so I think it's all of the writers, I know it becomes a personal negotiation, how far you're willing to go, or beyond what point you feel just guilty for what you're creating. And it's just a negotiation that happens with every moment of violence you confront in the work. And that was hard, I think. Not on Manto's?
Take your mic.
Just for us.
Yeah. I asked you that when we chatted a little bit before this talk. I asked Devika this question because I felt there was some emotional triggers, which some of which are violent, some of which are not, were off the page. They had happened, and then its impact was felt on the characters in the book. And that's why I asked her if there was a conscious of course, all the choices are conscious, but what was behind that choice? And I think, like, even I mean, you said that even when you write it in the news, or even when you write, I feel like we should ask those questions to ourselves much more than just put it out there. I'm constantly thinking about whether, and also like interviewing or we are constantly talking about whether we should write about the reasons and justifications that vigilantes give, or violent groups give, whether they're militants or whether it feeds it, but at the same time we want to understand it, we want to put it out there. So it's sort of a struggle with how you write about it, and that is the writing struggle, because the fact is there, and you always know much more than you put down on the page or in your article. And this is a struggle. I often find that's why, I mean, a lot of people feel like writing, say, news or non-fiction is just about facts, but it is not. Just like fiction is not just about imagination and either. So, Aakar, I wanted to ask you, when you write, you wrote this book on Price of the Modi years, where you're writing, it's a book full of facts, but there is the narrative in it, which goes beyond the fact. But constantly today, where this post-truth world and all of that. The fact somehow is not convincing enough. It never is. Apart from the fact that facts are harder to get our heads around for most people, they're just not convincing a lot of the time. So and that's why I read fiction more than I do non-fiction. I feel I'm convinced. I feel things more strongly. And I wait for people to make sense of the world for me through fiction or through really good narrative non-fiction or other artworks. When you look at these facts, what are you trying to infuse them with so they become as seductive as untruth?
No, I think that it's possible for us to inhabit different worlds with the same set of facts. So if Devika is in a world which says, oh, India's gone behind Bangladesh in per capita GDP, meaning that the average Bangladeshi is wealthier than the average Indian. But I am exalted by the fact that India is now the third largest economy and bigger than Germany. We are both right. There is no difference in terms of fact or numbers on what the two of us would be seeing. The difference is what element of non-material living is important to me. I think that for a lot of people who I would be able to have a drink with and have a conversation with, the material facts would be important at the level of the individual. I think for a lot of people on the other side, and I know some of them, the material facts would be important at the level of nation. That we've become a great nation, that we are part of the G20, that people will take their private jets and come to India from Washington and from Canada and not be able to leave when they want to. But those things are important to them. But they're material things.
Yes.
That this is a great nation because these people have come here and they've been given vegetarian food and they've been toasted with a roux afza, and so, maybe not roux afza because it's Muslim. Yeah. So the thing is, so there's two things. One is for those people you think want some material that responds to what you think, can you give them something of value? I think you're right because of that. And the second thing, and I think to my mind, which is what drives most writers, is trying to understand this kind of world yourself. That when you have fallen behind in material terms, those people that you despise, we don't like Bangladesh. Termites is what we call them. Gujus,
not we.
My lot calls them. Well, yeah, we. We have fallen behind them, but you're okay with that. As long as you have this kind of great kind of national existence in the world, you're warmed by it. There are people who go to bed today who feel good about themselves because this has happened. We've got a G20, we've got this convention center. Another one was actually inaugurated today with an air-conditioned non-AC section, I'm sure, and with veg and non-veg sections. But these are things that are important to people. That you have a train that looks like the Vande Bharat does and costs what it does. It might fail, that's okay, but I'm saying that the fact that it exists gives you a sense of confidence, a sense of pride, a sense that this is not the old, failed, poor nation that you grew up in, that you thought that people were talking about. This is something new, different, valorous, macho, and then that's the kind of material that you want to. There are very few parts in the world, especially in the democratic world, notionally democratic at least, where you can have the kind of material you can in India. Kamra said this, he's very right, itna material kahan milega. Very true. In New India, writers of fiction and non-fiction have more material than in any part of the world. I think that will remain true for a long time.
I'll ask my last question. Everyone think of your questions. We'll come to you after 2-3 minutes. Devika, I wanted to, one of the things that you talked about composite. There's this other thing that I feel fiction is constantly doing is this closure. Of course, a lot of writers, you think about closure and then you decide whether you want to give it to the reader or not, right? the world of that I inhabit, I don't have closure. I never do, and that is the impulse of my writing. And I think you started it in 2014, your book, and things are changing around you, and that's the world in which your characters live. What's the sort of closure you had envisioned for your book, and where did it, and what were the surprises on the way for you? How did you feel like you ended up? How far away from how you thought about it in the beginning?
I didn't have much of a sense of the story when I started.
You didn't?
No, I didn't. It came around in the first year or two. But when I just started, I was really just trying to make sense of a situation through these characters. And the story just grew through accretion. Like it kind of kept evolving. And though I had a sense of the spine over the first 2 years, the way it grew then was just, like I said, it kind of got fatter and fatter. It's like the seed that kind of attracts material to it. And so kind of what you are exploring gets more and more, complex, nuanced. And so story doesn't, for me, change when the end necessarily changes or when the beginning changes. The story is just so much more. And so I think in terms of closure, no, I'm struck by the number of similarities, actually. I don't feel any closure as far as the book is concerned. There is a point, somebody says, you don't ever finish a work of art, you only abandon it. And especially with the novel, because it's a place that could expand indefinitely. I could have easily spent another 4 years doing this. And so you just give it up when you kind of get exhausted. You're like, I'd like to think of something else now. But it's totally open-ended. The novel is, it's smarter than the writer. It takes into it so many other opinions and so many other experiences that one hasn't known. As in the novel itself, there's a point at which the writer makes an appearance and acknowledges that and says, this is as far as I could go with my imagination on this, and now it is for the reader to take it forward. So I don't see it as a kind of, sometimes with nonfiction, I feel there's, not creative nonfiction, but like when there's an argument, you reach the end of the argument, it's so tight, you cannot almost enter it. You take it like society takes it like a pill and you hope you feel better. But fiction is just so open-ended, and so it doesn't end with the day it gets published. It continues to live. The readers create the process, they complete the process, and this conversation is still an extension of what that book has opened up. So no closure. We're still with it. I'm still with it.
The Netflix and Amazon people will be very heartbroken that there is no ending.
They can find
an
one.
ending. They will force you to write one. Apparently, that's what they do these days. Aakar, you had a question.
So did you begin with characters, and did these characters change over the time that you wrote the book in your head?
Yes and no. In the sense, there was a moment I knew the story was coming together. I actually had some characters from previous work that kind of applied, so then I imported them. There were others that absolutely didn't exist, and so these characters kind of went into the world and found those characters. And so it's a very organic process. I did not know at the beginning how many characters there would be, where all the story would go, and that just opened up along the way. And so whether the impulse to write came first or the characters came first is almost a question that, it's chicken and egg, like how does one, at least in my process. I never, there's some writers who say I heard a voice, and then it told me the whole story, or the character suddenly appeared while I was on the train and spoke to me. I think I'm schizophrenic if that happened, I just would freak out. No character ever appeared to me and told me the story. It was just a long process of trying to make sense of, of these composites and their psychology and this moment through it, yeah.
While reading your book, I remembered some other books, and one of the things that Svetlana Alexievich, who I deeply admire in secondhand time, it's the story of the moment after the Soviet Union fell, and she finds all these documents. This is nonfiction, but written in a very experimental way, where these hundreds of voices and thousands maybe are coming through with their feelings. And one thing that really struck me is how many people missed the certainty of that of that time when the Soviet was full of promise, even though the shelves were empty, there were long lines, they were struggling, people didn't have a full stomach, most of them were hungry, and yet they missed it so much. So when I thought about that, because when all the writing that is coming out now, I think about whether 10 years later or 20 years later when we read it, will it seem more real what was written, or will it seem more surreal? I don't know. So I hope when we read back, that's what books do, or they also last forever, hopefully. Even if someone burns them, they will last forever. And yeah, so that's the end of our discussion. If people have questions, are they supposed to come up and ask, or just stand up and ask? Okay, just they will pass a mic around. Please raise your hands. There's a person in the front with a black t-shirt. Can you give him a mic? And let's try to keep them to questions. And if you have comments to make, thoughts, you can meet them later and tell them what your thoughts are.
Okay, thank you for the talk. So my question is it not a virtue, is it not considered a virtue anymore for the novel writer to at least try and not hide their biases? Now, for example, using sentences like a person who has blood on his hands is in charge of the country exposes a very clear bias. At what point does a book become propaganda and not a mere novel?
That was lines from her book, right? Yeah. Who are you asking the question to?
At least Aakar has non-fiction books, right? So I expect at least some pretense of trying to hide a bias in a novel, right? Because I don't want to be lectured when I read a novel. I just want to be entertained, more or less, like broadly. So my question is...
no, I think the act of writing, I think it's a good question. The act of writing is an act of putting down... Have I muted my mic? No, I haven't muted my mic. The act of writing is an act of displaying your bias. The writer does not presume that she is in any way independent of the reality or in any way not touched by the emotions of what all the rest of us feel. And I think that to assume that the writer is going to give you a puzzle of which you have to find the answer because it is so even-handed that you don't know what she is saying is not going to happen. The act of writing itself is bias. When you say that, let us say, India has defeated Lanka in the World Cup, which is a matter of fact. And the fact that we have a full house is because of the fact that we defeated them well in time. But the fact that India comes before Lanka in my sentence means something. What if I were to say Lanka was defeated by India in the World Cup? It's the same set of facts, but it's differently told. It's one of the great things about the Mahabharata is that it tries to distance itself. Sanjay is the one who's trying to interpret it for Dhritarashtra. And so writers are aware of the fact that you need distance. So they are trying to figure out what are the methodologies by which to do it. How do I distance myself from the same question which is universal and as old as it can get? But I would say to come back to what I said sort of earlier, that writers are not free of bias, and we should not assume that they are free of bias. Also, I would agree entirely with the statement that India is ruled by a man with blood on his hands. Whether or not you assume that this blood is deliberately shed, or you assume that this blood was shed because I'm not able to stop the shedding of it. The fact is that it was shed. 1,000 Gujaratis died. Did they not die? They died. If you are competent in governance, stop the bloodshed. If you can't stop the bloodshed, don't say you're competent.
Devika.
I think one thing is just to distinguish the authors from their characters. The line that you quoted is by a character, Rohit. And there are other characters in the book who have very different ideas of the character that Rohit is talking about. Now, it is true that, as I mentioned, in my talk, fiction ultimately betrays the writer. You may try to inhabit a lot of positions other than your own, but just its expanse is so wide, and the amount of sensory detail you have to put into it, your own interiority or your own tendency at some level is going to get exposed. But does that invalidate the whole effort of trying to inhabit these other voices and bring them into conversation? I don't think it does. And so therein, I personally don't read novels only for entertainment, and I'm always looking to, to encounter a new point of view or to be convinced of a different kind of subjectivity when I read.
Did you say that you don't read novels?
For entertainment. Why? Not only entertainment. The novel for me is just such a complex medium that is one of the things I delight in when I am reading. Otherwise, like I said, there are many other forms of narrative that you can go to where you don't have the whole puzzle of what does the writer think, what do they not, who are all these other people in the text. The novel keeps bringing that up on every page. Am I this person? Am I not? Is this really the writer or not? And and that is somewhere the efficacy of the work as well, that you're all the time guessing.
Yeah. Yep.
You've talked about the post-truth world a few times today, and my question comes from the space that post the kind of critique that Ministry of Utmost Happiness received as being non-fiction masked as fiction, was this daunting for you? In today's day and age, to write a book which has political opinion and conversation, was it something scary? Because I know there are a lot of people in this room who are fearful of voicing their opinions now. So I just wanted to know what that process was like.
I have to say that the levels of threat and coercion vary really depending on the vulnerability of the artist, who's publishing them, how incendiary is the thing that they're saying, whether a line can be picked up and distorted, and what language exactly. And so I think just the fact that you're writing in English, being published by HarperCollins, they've given you a big launch, so anything that goes wrong is going to get amplified already. Those things do award a certain amount of protection that one cannot deny, and that gives you a sense of more freedom than you might have had in a more vulnerable position. Of course, the current environment that we're living in, any line can get picked up and amplified. And, of course, that's something that my family has been very worried about. My mom's here in the audience. I think there's not a day in the last several years that she's like, but Devika, are you sure you want to, sort of confront these things and write about these things? And so that you live with. I think I've been living with this book so long, it's just, there is that feeling sometimes, just dekhenge, Hello? Okay, the mic is working. And so yes, I think there is some of that I don't know what it is, courage or foolhardiness that I think anybody who's writing in the present day on politics, has to have. But yeah, I do think that there are works that are taking still greater risks, and from artists who are far more vulnerable. And my worry is almost more for them and how we can create a safe space for them than what's going to happen with Quarterlife.
So this is basically more of a philosophical question about a premise that I assume you both share. So in the beginning you said something like, the thought behind the book is there is this pluralist narrative that we have, and we're trying to find the common shared reality between us. And there's three kinds of truth, Latin, Greek, and the third one is something Sanskrit. You realize some transcendental ontology to humans, like, oh my God, this is common reality between us all that we can then go back and share into. So this is my question. In the sense, I find a contradiction in this. Okay, there is a set of pluralist differences, and then there is a common ontology that we're trying to return back to. I claim, and I want you to contrast on this because that makes sense for me. I claim that there is no such transcendental ontology, and even if there was a common nature, it would be very limited. So something like, we assume a popular example that I use. We assume we want happiness. As humans, we want peace. I claim this is not the case. Like, whether it be psychoanalysis, whether it be new foundings in empirical psychology. And the second part of that question is, what I claim to be the actual common shared experience is one of difference itself, is one that promotes conflict in this very Nietzschean, Deleuzian manner. How do you, both of you, which I assume you both share the premises, how would you respond to that, or how do you resolve that conflict? Thank you.
What is the conflict again?
No, so the thing, when they translated out of Aramaic the New Testament, the word the Greeks used for truth and Jesus was the same. It is aletheia. That there was no division or bias informed in that word. And when the Greeks and the Europeans took Asian philosophical wisdom of faith, they assumed that what was there in those words, in Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, and the rest of it, absolute truth. And I think that it's the same for a writer, that while the output might have divergence in terms of what the message is, what is being tried to be sent across in those words, within the writer's mind there is a kind of repose out of which this material comes. I hope my answer was philosophical enough, but the fact is that this is a very difficult issue for writers to resolve. Unlike the New Testament, to be able to unleash something which is materially true, and materially true for all time, not just for 5 years or 6 months or like whatever else, because that's what a book is. We said that it stays, is not that easy. And this is a question that she and I and all the rest of us here will have to live with, not just for our previous works, but for the works that we are on and hopefully will be on tomorrow morning as well.
One thing that you mentioned, I'm not sure I understood the full extent of the question, to be very honest, but I think one thing you mentioned is just about shared reality, right? And what that constitutes and how we arrive at it and whether we're limited in some way by it. I think when one manages to tap into some kind of, as Aakar was saying, some kind of, I don't know, fundamental truths about human existence, death is grieved. When fiction does that consistently, does it page after page, it lives for years and decades, and it, generation after generation reads it because you have this feeling that it's telling you something fundamental about human beings. Then, of course, there's fiction that rings true because it's tapping into just the cultural values of its own time, in which case it may, for example, reflect some ideas about reality that are not going to hold, or some ideas about the human experience that are not going to hold 20 years later, which is why these books start to feel dated and eventually run out of print. And so I think there is that reach, there is that effort. How far a writer gets will always be, they'll always be limited by their talent. But I think you are, that is what you are going for. I hope that, I don't know if that answered your question, but
we'll have to still leave it at that and go to the next question.
Yeah, I have a question for both of you, Aakar and Devika. So I think from what I understand, one of the advantages of fiction is that it gives the writer this liberty to, sort of explore all of like these different perspectives, right? But I was wondering, is there any sort of like a moral obligation that the writer has to make sure that all of these different perspectives get equal weightage, or do you feel like that's something that's completely up to the writer because it's their own creation?
I mean, like this book, like I said, that was the heart of the structural sort of morphing of the book, right? Because there was this constant feeling that, am I being democratic enough? Am I not giving other characters enough room? But then on the other side, you have this voice coming of what does that kind of achieve? One is, does it create is it achievable at all? Like eventually someone is going to be silenced. Eventually there are going to be erasures in the book. So those will always stand. The second is, does it present a reality that is not actually the reality of our discourse? The third is, does it create, like if you identify with everybody in a city in a moment of violence, does it create a kind of moral relativism that still results in violence? And so one of the ways in which in Quarterlife I finally resolved that is to kind of funnel down after inhabiting a whole city, is to funnel down into the I and to, and there is the appearance of the I voice at the end of the book which says, well, but this is all the imagination of one person and this is how far it could go, and I don't pretend to omniscience, which probably it ties into the previous question as well. And so I think that's, that was the journey of this book, where I came at it with a very similar intention as the one you give voice to, which is to try and be more democratic, only to find that one can go perhaps only so far, which is a good reason why novels should never be read as allegories for the nation. No novel represents the nation. That is a fallacy, no matter how much novelists would like to believe it. But I don't know. Actually, I'm curious, since Rohini also does perspectives, kind of when do you feel you've given equal weight to a perspective? What makes you think of only 3 and sort of not more? Like, how did you resolve the number of voices or the people given a voice to in the work that, even though it's
I wanted to write about
nonfiction?
everyone I met. And it went from 12 to 5 to the comfortable 3, which is format done to death, but it felt comfortable. It exists so regularly because for a reason it works. But for me, it was there are political choices that I felt they were political, but they were also about the writing. Some of the choices were about whether I want to represent every single community, every single perspective. And then in the end, I felt like that then I wouldn't represent anyone truly. So then you pick, you pick some of them and you go deeper, and then you try to kind of confuse that very, very, very clear notion of that person with somebody else. Which is what I think you've done with all of these different characters, and which is why, another format thing which many fiction books have, which she's done really well, is a party scene where there are a bunch, I think 7 or 8 people, 9 people, talking different, some are quiet and some are not saying anything, and that felt like a room full of different perspectives, and it felt very much like many rooms that we are in, and that we should be also in, if we are not. I think, and it is like, that room is a reward for the reader also for staying with all these different characters until then, I felt. And also you get to know in that moment many more, much more of them, because they're being raw and they're being triggered and they're being, so I feel like there is no, you can't make a decision in the beginning. Some of that may have fed into how they sounded before and how they sounded later, that scene. So I feel like, that's what, I think those different choices add up to more than the sum at some point. I think we have to end here because there are time being shown on the side. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.